Welcome to Talent Strategy 60. I am your friendly neighborhood talent strategy nerd, Dr. Jim. And just like everybody else, I'm pretty sure everyone is super pumped when that entrance music pops on. So today we are here with another great panel and another great set of panelists. Sorry, I thought we were having trouble on the feed, so I just wanted to make sure we weren't. So today's conversation is going to be on career navigation and the Black professional. In this conversation, we are going to be tackling 3 problems that we want to solve for. Now, granted, we're not going to have a comprehensive solution on every single one, but we're going to make headway, and that's one of the big things that we want to be able to solve. So goal number 1 is to help Black professionals identify the organizations that are most likely to have the infrastructure necessary to help them be successful. The second thing that we're going to focus on in this conversation is how best to cultivate sponsors as a Black professional within corporate America. And then the third topic that we're going to tackle is going to be why it's important to decode the hidden language of corporate America. So there is a lot of deep conversations that we're going to have in this discussion today. And joining us to guide us through the conversation is our esteemed group of panelists. And we will quickly do some introductions so that everybody that is watching the feed on LinkedIn or on YouTube will be able to get familiar with our panelists. So first off, I want to introduce John Graham to the show. John, welcome aboard.
Good to be with you again, Jim, and these fine panelists as well. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, super excited to have you on. Tell us a little bit about your background and story so that the audience is familiar with.
Yes. So Vice President of Global Employer Brand Diversity and Culture at Shaker Recruitment Marketing, where we develop employee value propositions, employer brands, and recruitment marketing strategies that incorporate DEI from the very onset to ensure that our clients don't sell a false narrative to attract talent into burning buildings. Ultimately, my background as an author, a historian, Black professional, lend themselves to making sure that we're creating safe environments psychologically as well as professionally for people to thrive.
Great stuff, John. You mentioned something that has come up in our conversations, which is you don't want to be misrepresenting your talent attraction, your culture by bringing people into burning buildings. Tell us a little bit more about the context behind that statement.
Well, if you think about the attrition rates, specifically for Black talent, but marginalized talent in general, Black talent have the highest attrition rates typically in corporate America. What we see is a disconnect between what's sold and what is lived once you convert to an employee. And so I want to ensure that our clients are cultivating not only cultures where people can grow and thrive, but ultimately where they would be proud enough to share their experiences with their own networks and as ambassadors. So we work very much so on the culture transformation in addition to the attraction of talent so as to reduce attrition.
Really good stuff. And I'm a big advocate for taking a holistic approach to your talent strategy. You can't just tackle one piece of that employee life cycle and expect it to be successful. It's something that you and I are very well aligned on. So I appreciate you sharing that. Next up, I want to bring Sierra Belser to the forefront. Sierra, tell us a little bit about yourself and get the audience familiar with some of your background and story.
Absolutely. My name is Sierra Belser, and I am Director of National Partnerships for Excelsior Staffing. We're a minority-owned staffing firm with 180 locations across the U.S. And I have been in those shoes where I have been climbing the corporate ladder and not feeling seen and heard. So thank you so much for bringing this conversation to the forefront today. I probably have a whole book that I could write on being a Black woman in corporate America, and especially being in a male-dominated field such as staffing and working in the manufacturing setting. So looking forward to today's conversation.
Well, you mentioned a couple of things that caught my interest. You probably, if you're really serious about writing a book, I know a guy on this panel actually who's actually written one, so you might want to get with him. But the other part that I'm really interested in getting a little bit more detail about, if you're open to it,
Mhm.
is sharing some of your experiences, both from the perspective of as a Black woman navigating corporate America and as a Black woman navigating a male dominated space when we're talking about staffing and recruiting. Tell us a little bit about how that shaped your career trajectory and the things that you're involved in.
I had to really do some soul searching and learn how to move and shake within the good old boy society, right? So a lot of men are already brought up in situations where they're raised to know how to network, navigate, and be in boardrooms. Where a lot of females were learning how to be a mother, how to be a housewife, how to sustain a home and a family, right? So when I got into the corporate space, I really had to learn how to play the game. And sometimes that game did not always have a seat for me at the table. So we had to make sure that as women, we are seen, we are heard, and we have a voice, and not be afraid to use that power in situations that we may not necessarily be comfortable in or have that experience in. So I know one of the topics for today is making sure you have that mentor and that.
Looks like we might have lost Sierra really quick. Oh, there you are. Sierra, we lost you for a second.
Sorry.
Uh,
I've definitely had some sponsors and some amazing mentors that have helped me navigate through that space, especially when there were times where I was feeling like I didn't know how to make myself and my presence known. So I'm glad that today we're going to discover all of that.
No, I'm glad that you talked about the issue of or the topic of sponsorship and mentorship, because I think there's a pretty strong relationship there that we're going to explore in this discussion. Last but certainly not least, I want to introduce James Daverman, who I have known for quite a long time. And I call him Dr. Daverman just because of our history together. But I want to welcome him to the show. He's going to have a unique perspective. James, why don't you get the audience, the viewers and listeners up to speed on a little bit about your background and trajectory?
Sure. I'm currently the director of store finance and analytics for Ross Stores. I've got 2,000 stores across nationwide, 20 billion in sales, and are the ultimate retail growth story. And my trajectory as far as getting to this position was a little bit unorthodox. And Jim, as you know, my focus in life is to ensure that marginalized people and minorities have both the access and exposure, the requisite access and exposure necessary, to be able to gain some opportunities and to find them where they lay. And I'm excited to share, some of the tips that I learned over the years today, and also learn from these two prestigious panelists, whose lives revolve around this very sort of thing. And so, thanks for having me today.
No, I'm super excited to have you on. And I think it'd be worthwhile for you to share a little bit about, you mentioned you took an unorthodox path to where you are. And in full disclosure to everybody that's watching, James was actually our first featured guest on the Cascading Leadership podcast that Lawrence and I did. And what was really amazing about James's story, and I'll let him tell it in just a second, is the roots that he came up in. So share with the audience a little bit about, where you came from and kind of what that growing up period looked like, so that we have a good sense of, the origin in comparison to where you are now.
Jim, we've only got an hour today, so I'll make it short and sweet. Typical, stereotypical inner city background as far as growing up. But I was in a very unique situation in that my mother would drop me off at the library on her way to work every day and just leave me there all day because, couldn't afford childcare, etc. And I just took the opportunity to read voraciously while there, and that awakened something in me. And that, I'd always thought differently, and I always wanted to know why we were in the situation that we were versus what I was seeing on shows like Dynasty, etc. And so I started engaging a lot more into books, and that kind of opened, my world, so to speak. So right after high school, joined the military. So that was the first unorthodox step. I was in there for 3 years, did it for the college money, got my tuition subsidized. So that was another tip or trick, what have you. did that, got into college, and realized how important it was to network, because some of the richer students and some of the students who were in the know already had things lined up. And I didn't know how to navigate internships and preparing for life after college. So I had to learn that the hard way. Worked in corporate America for a couple of years, got a start at the Walt Disney Company, worked at Bloomberg LP. And that's when I had a boss take a very active interest in my career. And that's when I learned the difference between mentorship and actual sponsorship. And so, thankfully I had a sponsor who enabled me to, who pushed me, drove me, and helped me get into an Ivy League business school. Learn a lot about networking there, because that's actually the point of those schools, and was able to further develop my career. And the reason that I'm currently in role is because my current boss, during our interviews and during our discussions, everything centered around her serving as a sponsor for me and actually opening some of the doors that I may not have, had access to otherwise. And I'm very thankful. And part of it is just learning how to be intellectually curious, uncomfortable, and learning how to get to know people who don't necessarily look like you. That has been really eye-opening for me, because, it's very difficult to do. It's very difficult to just engage with people who may have different backgrounds, et cetera. But there's always common ground to be found. And I'm still working on that, but that has helped me tremendously. That's about the long and short of it.
We're gonna do a lot of deep dives in those areas, and I think you set up some really interesting conversation points. And one of them, which we're going to tackle today, is this whole idea of all three of us, or all four of us, to varying degrees, have had to figure this stuff out by trial and error. And the part of what we're trying to do here is to decode some of that stuff so that there's an easier path for those that are coming up behind us. So I appreciate you sharing some of the context behind your career trajectory, because I think it's going to be valuable and it's going to come into play in this discussion. So let's set the stage a little bit, and I want to point out a few things that are going to be relevant to the conversation. And it ties into why are we having this conversation in the first place. When you look at the entire history of the Fortune 500 companies, there's only been 22 Black CEOs that have occupied that top tier in those organizations. And some people might be listening to that thinking, oh, well, what's the big deal? I think that signals a huge problem, because when you look at the challenges that underrepresented communities have in general in navigating the corporate world, and Black professionals in particular have in navigating the corporate world, it's almost two completely different universes that we're dealing with. And part of the reason ties back to what James described in terms of there's a whole series of language or practices that are generally hidden from the views or hidden from the sight of folks in underrepresented communities and more importantly in Black communities. So I'd like to get everybody's quick take on why that exists, or how you respond to that scenario and how that's impacted you. I want to lead off with Sierra and get your take on it, Sierra, as far as the situation on the ground and how that's had a personal impact on you as you navigate your career.
I think James said it. It's about knowing how to navigate and network your way in those spaces. I think that, first of all, you have to have a knowledge of networking and how crucial that is to getting you in the rooms and invited to the places that you need to be. But then also realizing the importance of networking up from where you are today. Being in those rooms with the higher up people that are the decision makers, those C-suite leaders that can navigate you and help you get to those spaces where you're trying to go. I was actually at an event last night where I was talking to a gentleman who is an amazing entrepreneur. And he was telling me that he does not own a suit and does not own a tuxedo. And so I asked him, what do you do when you get invited to a special event or a special occasion? And he said, I just don't go. And I had to explain to him, you're missing out on making money and having business opportunities because you're putting yourself in this box because you don't want to dress up or play the part. It's all about playing the game and knowing how to navigate those spaces. And that's the only way that as a culture and as a society that we're going to make it our way to the top.
No, that is some phenomenal insight. And I think you mentioned a couple of things that I'd be curious to get John's take on it. And that's this concept of developing your voice. We all know in general, and where I'm not speaking in monolithic terms, but generally speaking, if you're from an underrepresented community, you're less likely to speak up and have agency for yourself. And that's what I gathered from your point, Sierra, is the value of that. John, what would your reaction or advice be when it comes to building your voice and building your own agency in these sort of situations?
It's a great question. The conversation around voices is an interesting one, only in the sense that when you are I'll just speak from my own experience, a Black professional, you have to be able to modulate your voice and its authenticity depending on the space you're in. In my book, Plantation Theory, A Black Professional Struggle Between Freedom and Security, we talk about code switching. We talk about the duality, the need to reduce threat perception, right? And the tactics that we use to do so, not just in how we speak and the prosody and the articulation, but also in stature and dress and hairstyle and all of these other things. And so developing the voice, first and foremost, is not just the voice for the part. It's also a very strong foundation in who you are. And knowing what it is you are willing to pay, as in the cost for the climb, to navigate these spaces as you move up the ladder. So development of voice is, I think, a multifaceted conversation unto itself, and the things that are required for people that look like us to move up ladders.
Yeah, I mean, I think any one of these things that we're tackling in this conversation could be a conversation in and of itself. And James, I'm going to put you on the spot here because we have a great question coming from the audience. And thank you, Tripp, for sharing that. And his question is, what strategies have you used to better understand the environment that you're working in? And I think you would offer some really unique insights given your career trajectory in a lot of the biggest companies that people are familiar with. So share with us a little bit about how you navigated and threaded that needle.
When it comes to developing that voice, I find what's helped me the most is just being willing and able to ask upfront, observe, and ask some more. And what that essentially means is that when you're listening to the way that you interact with someone, there are certain things that they tell you where you understand this is negative, or there are certain polite ways they put things where you understand the chances of something happening are very slim. Whenever my boss tells me she's disappointed or I missed the mark on something, I know that means that was a tremendous screw up, that occurred that I need to clean up ASAP. And so most of it is just being willing and able to ask up front. At every point where I've had an interview, I've always asked the interviewer, the hiring manager, I'd love to take this role, but I hope that you come along with it as a mentor. And, I'd like to see what their reaction is. Some of them are very serious about it. Some of them, will go into deep detail about the development efforts they have for their employees, both minority and non-minority alike. Some will help you game plan your career. I mean, they're very generous when, you make that, when you present them with that question. Some of them will give you a political answer and sort of brush it off. And then you kind of understand, okay, I'll be on my own if I end up accepting this role. And so, those are certain things to consider. You should also know the difference between a mentor and a sponsor. And that's something that took me a while to learn. Mentors will, they'll provide mentorship. They'll give you tips. They'll share war stories with you. They'll tell you how to navigate things. But what the sponsor will do is go an extra step and use the power that they have or the pull that they have to ensure that certain doors are open for you, that air cover is provided. Should you be the recipient of any undue criticism, they'll introduce you, to the right people. And so if you can establish that early on during the interview process, early on at the onset, make it part of your individual development plan, you can get some significant traction, once you put that stuff in writing. And so that's something that I'd urge more people to do. I mean, I understand it's exciting to just take the job and you assume you'll deal with whatever comes later. But I find that dealing with these things up front and setting expectations really do go a long way. And then as you learn, your voice will organically, develop, and you'll be able to have a little bit more agency and role.
Really good stuff, JD. And I appreciate a lot of the things that you mentioned there. There are a couple things in terms of a nuanced perspective that I'd like to have John chime in on. And part of it is, how do you sequence these conversations in the right way so you're not perceived as a threat? Because that's a consideration. Because if you're one of those people like me who's loud and direct, depending on who you're talking to, that can get perceived the wrong way. So when you're talking about decoding the language, presenting the right way, what's your experience in terms of actually threading that needle and handling it with an appropriate level of nuance?
Was that for me or for James? Sorry.
No, that was for you, John.
Gotcha. Well, I mean, to the question, and I think, James, you touched on something so important that I think a lot of Black professionals aren't coached on, aren't given access to or proximity to, unless they're in certain circles, communities, or institutions. And that's understanding how to decode the psychological, linguistic conversations that happen within corporate spaces. And what I mean by that is the things that are spoken, that are unsaid, but spoken very clearly to those who can understand them. So when you say, your manager suggesting that, wow, that was a miss, right? The expansiveness of that statement could go over the heads of some people, right? Yes, I might have made a mistake, but you don't know the depth of or the repercussions of that mistake. And so a lot of times we find ourselves in these meetings or in these situations where there's a different language being spoken, and it's very much rooted in psychology. But and when you get into how different cultures prioritize different language or linguistic patterns, for instance, Black communities prioritize the linguistic conversation. So what is it that you're saying specifically? And that's how I'm judging, not only you as a person who's speaking to me, but also what to do and how to act. And that's why we have statements like, your word is your bond, or, stand on your word, or say what you mean and mean what you say, versus power dominant language, which speaks in the encoded, which is based on centuries of what's called politeness culture, or the codes of politeness that date back centuries. So unless you've grown up in proximity to that, you're not even understanding what's being said, even though you're focused on the words that are being said, stated in a room or a particular meeting or environment. And I think that's critical, right? The consequence for not understanding those linguistic patterns could be things like, ooh, they're not leadership material, or they're a little bit rough around the edges, right? Or they might need leadership development skills. And it has nothing to do with your work output, but everything to do with your inability to speak the language of power, right? So I'm glad you brought that point up, because I think it's super important for a lot of people to understand.
That is, there's a ton of gold in just what you just said, John, and I appreciate you bringing that to the table. And say what resonated with me is the rough around the edges part of it, because I don't have the same experience as anybody else on this panel, but I've had to deal with that too as a brown person. So, hey, you need to like getting behind that phrase with more actionable ways to kind of advance it is a really good point that you made. So I want to switch gears a little bit. So we've talked, not really switch gears, but we've had a lot of conversations so far in terms of, what is it like navigating a lot of these hidden doorways and pathways that you're trying to advance your career. And I'd like Sierra to offer her insight from the perspective of if you're a Black professional looking for a company that is oriented the right way and is likely to be supportive, is likely to put you in a position to be successful. What should you be looking for? And I'd appreciate if you tie it into what Stephanie had asked in the chat. What's the balance between finding that right organization where it allows you to be as authentic as you can be, and understanding what the lines are in terms of what traditional professionalism requires as well? Any insights into that you can share with the audience?
Well, first of all, do your research, right? the companies are pretty much transparent thanks to social media. So making sure that that company, their leadership, does it even look like you? Does it represent something that you want to be a part of, a culture that you might enjoy working with every day? Do they have DE&I strategies? You know, everybody thinks that DE&I is the new on and popping thing, but are they really serving DE&I the way that they should be, or is it just a political statement, right? So making sure that their DE&I strategies, their corporate responsibility initiatives, and all those things, their mission statements are aligned with what you want to see in a company. But then if that company does not have all of that, are you willing to be that change agent to go in and help them cultivate a culture that is inclusive of everybody? Are you willing to be that person that's going to speak up and explain the value that DE&I brings and diversity brings to an organization? I have been in both situations. I have been in a situation where the company looked like they were DE&I forward facing and had all these initiatives in place, but then realized that I was D&I. Like, they put me in a place of leadership to make it look and feel like they really were having those initiatives and goals. But then I've been in companies where maybe DE&I wasn't blasted on every piece of social media, but they really do have some great DE&I initiatives and policies within the company, but they just don't put it out there for everybody to see. So really making sure that the company that you want is the company that's going to align with you and your values. And then, of course, networking within that company to see what is some feedback from some employees. You have LinkedIn now, so you have access to their employee database, so to speak. So before I decide that I'm going to take a role with the company, I'm going to seek out some of their diverse people that are already working as employees, get some feedback from them. What is it like working? How is the company culture? Are there some things that you can bring to the table that maybe I'm not even thinking about? Start the conversation to see if that's really a company that either just looks good on paper, or are they really, really a good culture fit for you?
Man, so I'm not seeing a whole lot of emojis coming out on the live stream after what both you and John and James have said so far. So for those that are watching this on the stream, there have been already a couple of mic drop moments that I want to see some reaction on. The chat has been great. So really great points, Sierra. And I have a quick follow-up for you, or to you, on really understanding, or at least what are some of the cues that candidates need to be looking at to get a sense of true commitment to DEI within the organization. Because there are, I mean, we've all seen it. We've all seen organizations that throw up the various celebrations for the month, and that's really about it. How can you get a better sense of real commitment to DEI that candidates should be exercising as part of their job search plan?
Well, there's a couple of things before you even get to the interview phase of the portion of the show. Follow their social media and see what kind of initiatives, what kind of community initiatives are they involved in, right? If you see that they're involved in things that you wouldn't be involved in on a personal level, then I probably wouldn't want my company to be involved with those organizations and those types of people. And then when you get to the interview room, start asking those questions that are valuable to you about their DE&I initiatives and policies. Like, do you guys have a supplier diversity initiative within your company to make sure that you're giving those opportunities to smaller economic businesses? Do you have any type of community outreach? Do you offer me opportunities to volunteer and share my passions within the company? Our company with the Own Group, we do a quarterly cultural diversity luncheon where we just have the opportunity to really get to know each other. They provide lunch. We do a celebration of employees, but it gives us an opportunity to all come together. Are they doing initiatives and things like that to make me feel like I'm being seen and heard?
Awesome stuff. I'd like to get John's input on non-performative DEI. So, John, share with the class a little bit of your advice and things that you look out for when you're advising Black professionals in their career search and their career navigation effort.
Yeah, so I'll be brief. And I love everything Sierra said. In addition to, look at their leadership. All of these sites typically, or all of these companies typically have their executive leadership on their career sites or on their corporate sites. Start there. And then when you look at their commitment statements, then pull up their leadership and just see if they match. That's one. Two, a lot of the smart companies that have ERGs, employee resource groups or affinity groups, are introducing candidates to the affinity group of their choice at the interview stage so that they can get a better perspective. Seek that out. And then lastly, ask better questions. What is the attrition rate for specific demographics? What are you doing to address those things? What have you done to create a culture that people would not only want to join, but people want to stay? Those are better questions for recruiters that force them to go past the fluff answers of all of the champagne and roses, right? And these are the things that honestly you want to know before you go in, because all of the other things, the initiatives and the expressions of DEI through, I call it theater, but essentially the programming, those are to benefit the company. How do you fit in there as an intended beneficiary of that work?
Really, I think on your point about asking better questions, there's a number of ways that you can add nuance into it, and you can ask those questions about, hey, when you look at the salaries for this particular band within this particular function of the enterprise, what's the salary distribution when it comes to people from underrepresented communities, men, women, all of those different ways. And that'll give you a signal on how committed organizations are. Ask those questions in terms of promotion criteria. Like how often is it, how are promotions handled? Like what's the hard criteria? So these are all great things that, man, we could make a full show about those sort of things. So really, really great conversation so far. And based on kind of what I'm seeing in the chat, in the feed, it's there's a lot of questions that are coming out. One of the things that I want to pivot to a little bit is this. Let's just say you found the right organization and they seem to be supporting your goals as a professional. Now that you're in the doors, what are the things that you need to be doing to position yourself for the best chance of success? And I want to have James offer his insight. How do you set the stage for success once you're in an organization that appears to be right? Just because it looks like it's a fit, that's not guaranteed. So what's your advice when it comes to navigating inside the doors?
Well, probably the hardest thing to get a handle on whenever you're starting a career or starting at an organization is the politics. You want to get a handle on that fairly quickly. There was a company a couple of years back. I don't want to name names because I don't want to defame anyone, but this particular company's CEO came out and said, we don't have any minorities in our executive ranks because we just can't find minority talent because there's just none available, which we all know obviously is a crock. And then he ended up having to apologize, etc. And what they uncovered was that this company would routinely interview women and minorities for positions that they had already filled. And so they were sort of gaming, their DEI and, things like that, present that are part of that performative DEI that you were mentioning before. In terms of positioning your own self, you have to start acting early and quickly in terms of building your allies. Your allies and your advocates. Allies are people who support you laterally. Your advocates are people above you who take an interest in your work, or people to whom you've pledged undying loyalty and have done great work for, who rely on you and have taken an interest in having those career development discussions with you. People tend to be very siloed in particular roles. I'm the type of person, if I'm working on a project and I get a chance to work with a different department, I immediately start networking within that department. And people tend to have a negative view of networking. They think it's a fast talking, card carrying, person who really doesn't take an interest in people and is just looking for the next lead. No, it's just taking an interest in people, developing a relationship, and perhaps down the line it can lead to something or something else, either internally or externally. And when you take that approach, you'll find yourself building relationships once again with people who don't necessarily come from your background or look, the way you do, and they can give you some insight into some of the politics going on. Some of the hidden language, aside from rough around the edges that you might hear, is this person lacks polish, or doesn't have the kind of executive presence that we want. When you're able to get this sort of feedback, you can then use it, to perhaps take a management communications course, or have a discussion, with your manager in terms of improving these sorts of things. So it's just pay attention, observe, and network outside of your peer group, and network outside of your main work group, and then you'll be able to get a handle on how the internal politics of a company run to a certain extent. And I think that helps a bit.
No, it does help, and it actually opens up a couple of other questions. I like the point that you made about networking internally. I like the point that you made about professional development. I think the one thing that I would add from a professional development perspective is if you get a comment along the lines of, oh, you need more executive presence, I think it's critical for those of us that are receiving that feedback to have people define what that actually means, so you're not running off on some direction where it's not connected to the actual meaning of the phrase. So really great points, JD. I want to have Sierra chime in on this a little bit and expand on networking in general from an internal networking perspective, but also the concept of building a board of directors within an organization to help you better navigate that political landscape, so that you can have that trusted advisor that's telling you, hey, when they say this, this is what they mean, that sort of stuff. What's your take on both of those elements of navigation?
So I think James was right. Navigation is probably the hardest part of learning how to play the office politics, right? For me, you never stop being your own advocate and making sure that you are representing yourself and making sure that you are being spoken of, even when you're not in the room. That has been something that has definitely helped carry me through my career. Being invited to different events because of the network and the sponsorships and the mentors, to where I remember showing up at an event, and the company that I was working for at the time was being awarded an award. Did not invite me to be there, but I got invited by one of the people that were actually putting on the event, and got to sit tables ahead of the company that didn't even invite me to be there. So when you walk in the room and there's the shock and awe that how did you get here? That's when you know that you're being advocated by others and have sponsors that are speaking for you, even when maybe your own company doesn't recognize you. As far as your leadership and your board of directors, it is definitely important to have those allies at every level of an organization to make sure that you have the support that you need to move up in the organization, or possibly move out of the organization, right? Once you figure out that culture and that environment is not healthy for you, and
Sierra,
I know I keep cutting out, but definitely making sure that you have those advocates at every level to help you navigate and maneuver. There have been times where they had to be very frank with me and say, this is not the network or the organization that's going to allow you to cultivate and be the person that we know that you can be. And so then that's when you need to pivot and move in another direction.
So I really like the one. I like a lot of what you just said, Sierra, but I especially like the admonition that, when you realize that it's time to move on, you need to make a move, because we're not living in a world where, you need to stay 10 years at a place that's just terrible and just kind of suck it up. There's a lot of opportunity out there. And I think saying that out loud to folks from underrepresented communities is important, because we often are in situations where we have this fixed mindset where we think these opportunities are limited, and we need to get out of that. At least it's my belief, we need to get out of that sooner than later. The one thing that I'm curious about, and I want John's take on it, is, James referenced this. Oh, XYZ person, we can't find anybody that fits our culture, or we can't find any people from underrepresented communities to hire. Decode that? What does that actually mean from a culture perspective, and how is that just a crutch that a lot of organizations use?
I want to say the company's so bad because I know which company it is. I know people who were in that DEI function when that statement was made, and I know they're no longer there. But either way, it's an admonition on that executive's part that he is not entrenched or exposed to any cultures outside of his homogenous everyday environment. And that is the case for many in executive leadership positions. And let's be honest, we still live in a very segregated world, right? Especially if you live in the United States. And so one of the key things that I encourage executives to do who tout support for DEI initiatives and increasing numerical representation and transforming their culture is to start with themselves. I say all DEI is local, right? So if you don't have diversity in the neighborhood you live in, the church you go to, or wherever your place of worship, where your children go to school, where you shop, all of these things, then the extent of your exposure to diverse cultures is at work. And at this point, that's only through, hybrid situations or distributed workforce relationships, right? Through virtual. And that's not enough. And so when you suggest you can't find, what it really says is you don't have diversity within your own networks or circles of trust and so forth. And so we need to first start with increasing cultural intelligence and exposure to different cultural backgrounds with executive leadership.
So I want to follow up on your comment about increasing cultural intelligence, and I'm going to shift the conversation a little bit in this direction. I want everybody's input on it. When we're talking about that as an objective, we have to increase an organization's cultural intelligence. What are a couple of things that organizations need to be thinking about to be intentional about doing that? How would you advise an organization on their journey to increasing their cultural intelligence?
Well, first and foremost, we start with data. I've actually developed a proprietary survey instrument that essentially quantifies the lived experiences of marginalized talent in contrast to their majority counterparts. It's called the Lived Experience Survey, and that enables us to have a better conversation about the gaps in culture and experience between your marginalized and your majority talent. Once you have that, then we can start to talk about, whose comfort is prioritized, right, in the decision making. Who are the intended beneficiaries of the work and the outcome? What do you want your culture to look like as an outcome where you can say that we actually live this and it's embedded versus we're still on a journey, right? What would it look like? And so you have to start with first and foremost, I think, really good foundational data to have an honest conversation, and then be clear on what change is going to feel like, right? I always say that everybody has an appetite for change until you serve up the meal, right? And then you have to determine if you're going to like these spices or if you're going to like this particular flavor of change. And at that time, I think then you can make some more informed decisions. But again, you have to start with data.
Really good stuff on the data side of it. I'm curious about Sierra's input on this, but with a slightly different twist. You and I both come from the staffing world. I used to be in it. You're full out in it. And as a practitioner, we've both encountered situations where organizations, you'll have a great candidate that you present, and they respond back, well, this person isn't a culture fit, and they're making that determination off of a piece of paper. They haven't even talked to that person. So how do we deconstruct that aspect of that conversation from a cultural lens? What are some of the ways that we can kind of combat that tendency that a lot of organizations still have to making cultural determinations off of pieces of paper?
I think that's a funny point that you brought up, Jim. Yeah, there's no way to really see on a piece of paper or a PDF that I have sent you of a resume whether or not this person's going to be a culture fit. So I always, two things I actually do. So from the recruiter side of me, I never send the resume. I actually send the bullet points from within the body of the resume that automatically fit with the job description and some things that I know are a good fit. So they fall in love with the person before they actually see the resume. So let's say that you're in a job search currently, don't just send your resume to the person that's hiring, the hiring manager. Send some things that you've already learned about the company, how you think you're a good fit for the culture, things that you could bring to the table that they don't already have, and then ask for the meeting. I'm not defined by a piece of paper. I have so much that I can bring to an organization, and I'm sure all of you have so much to bring to an organization that probably doesn't even fit on that one piece of paper that we're supposed to have as a resume now. So making sure that you do your homework on the company and find ways that you can add value to that company. And I think as recruiters, it's our responsibility to do that. I don't give a name on my intros. I just say, here's a candidate. These are their specialties. These are the things that I think that they can bring to your team. When can we set up a call? I'm not asking, do you want to? When can we set up the call? Because I know this person's going to be a good fit. It's the confidence.
That's phenomenal advice. And I would recommend anybody that's watching this from the staffing and recruiting space, write that down if you're not already doing it. Don't send the resume. If you're going to send a resume, anonymize as much as you can other than what that person's delivered. And then that way you're forcing the hiring manager or person on the other side to evaluate a candidate on their merits versus the optics. So really great stuff. James, I'd like you to have some of your input in terms of how you've navigated these sort of conversations from the hiring side. I know that you've been involved in interviews and the hiring process, and you have a particular lens that you want to use. So what are some best practices from the hiring side that you would advise organizations to take when they're evaluating candidates that are inbound?
Well, I'll piggyback a little bit off Sierra with the blind resume reviews. I found those, and I'm not keeping statistical track of the demographics that we get from them, but I've seen a noticeable increase in the diversity of candidates that we've sourced as a result of using that method. So it definitely works when you're focused just on the person's capabilities without looking at name or any clubs or groups that might give away what their background is, or interests that might give away what their background is. Another thing, I always like to joke that HR has very little imagination when it comes to talent acquisition and sourcing. And I understand we have fixed budgets. There are only so many places you can recruit from, and I get that. But a lot of these companies should be a little bit more intentional in casting as wide a net as possible, to find talent. When a CEO gets up and says they can't find any minorities, imagine how that trickles down through the rest of the company. If the company's head believes that or feels that way, they've no impetus to change from that standpoint. But there are so many professional groups, minority-oriented professional groups for all sorts of different, types of careers that you can source. They're HBCUs. There are professional organizations. There are resource groups. You can ask people from your resource groups to help you source candidates externally. I've been involved in the hiring process, and I find that has helped the most. Casting that wide net, being intentional about getting as much access to talent as possible, whether it's diverse or not. I mean, I don't start with a quota or a cap or a certain number, and it just organically you just are able to source candidates you otherwise wouldn't see had you stuck to the most traditional recruiting methods. So I'd say be a little bit more intentional about just casting that wide net and looking under every nook and cranny, rather than just having a fixed pipeline that many minorities either may not be aware of, may not have access to, or may not have experienced. When you look at that group of CEOs that you mentioned, Black CEOs in companies, they have the bluest of blue chip backgrounds, almost all of them. And so if that's where you're focusing your searches for these sorts of candidates, you're going to have a hard time finding significant numbers because those people are obviously in very high demand. But there are people who have the skills and the capabilities and the talents, who are not necessarily at, coming out of Oxford or something like that. And, those are they'll find other opportunities elsewhere. And I think we miss a really good chance, at developing, diversity if we pass on people like that. And if we're not even seeing them. And so once again, just cast that wide net.
It's really great points. And I know that John's been doing double duty, chiming in on the chat and the live stream. And you mentioned something, John, that caught my attention because I had a little rant about it this morning. Some of the top trends, there was a Forbes article that came out, some of the top trends in 2023 that HR professionals and practitioners should be looking at were listed, and there was 10 of them. One of the trends on that list was hiring based on skills versus pedigree. And my reaction to that was, that's a trend That's stuff that you should be doing anyways. So like, if you're catching me off of a live camera, I probably would have added a few other words to it, but it's kind of ridiculous that we have some of these common sense things that you should be doing that's popping up as trends within the world of work. And it's it caught my attention when you mentioned that. So thanks for chiming that in and having me go off on a rant, John.
My pleasure. Always.
So really great conversation.
One thing I wanted to add, Jim.
Sure.
You also want to make sure that if the executives aren't personally invested in these initiatives, they typically won't go anywhere, or they won't go beyond window dressing. And, once again, if I find that a company has a robust DEI initiative, but there's no executive presence, there are no executives pushing it, there are no executives having conversations about it in the media or elsewhere, then I kind of question, how serious the commitment is.
No, really. Your point about executive sponsorship is super on point. I can't think of a better word, but I think that's very instructive, because attitude will reflect leadership. So if your leadership isn't supporting any initiative, never mind a DEIB initiative, it's not going to have legs, because it's just going to be a going through the motions approach. So as we wind down this conversation, and I want to thank everybody for their input, I'm going to limit each of you to one key takeaway for the Black professional that is navigating this their professional journey. And it could be on identifying the right organization. It could be on how to cultivate your sponsors and mentors within an organization. It could be on decoding the language, anything that we've talked about, or it could be something else that we didn't really get the chance to spend time on. So first off, I want to have Sierra offer her key takeaway, and then we'll follow it up with John and JD on their takeaways.
I would say network and know your strengths. So when you are in these networking opportunities, make sure that you have your elevator pitch when you make your introduction to these people, saying, this is who I am, this is what I do, and this is how I do it. You are your own advocate in majority of these situations, and nobody can advocate for you better than yourself. So make sure you know who you are, what you want, and make those introductions and network to your net worth.
Awesome stuff. Thank you, Sierra. John, you're up.
I love that. Network to your net worth. Bars. Love that. I will say I do a lot of speaking engagements, especially with Black ERGs. And the title of one of my speaking engagements is called The Cost of the Climb. And so my advice is know the cost of the climb first and foremost. Be prepared to pay that cost and whatever that comes with. And if you're willing to pay that price, then you have to understand the game you're playing, and then you have to navigate accordingly. So be aware that there are trade-offs, there are costs. I've spoken to several of the few Black CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, and some of their biggest regrets were the amount of identity suppression that they had to endure to get to where they were, right? And that's notable. So I always encourage people to go into these things with your eyes open, be very aware of the game you're playing, and be willing to pay the price or the cost of the climb.
Great stuff, John. James, you're up.
As you peruse through LinkedIn and you look around at your networks and you look around at people getting opportunities, at some point you'll stumble upon several people who either have less talent than you do, are less capable than you are, but have a lot more confidence and a lot more access and a lot more and more robust networks, and they're getting ahead of you at a much quicker pace. And so you should always strive to be in the know by any means necessary. And once again, that means befriending people that don't look like you. That means having these conversations during your interviews about career development. That means tapping every resource possible to make sure that you are as well networked as those getting ahead of you. And so, yeah, just be intellectually curious, be open-minded, really, and try to be in the know, because there's a lot of, and I like to call this asymmetrical information distribution, across groups. And it's usually that lack of information access that puts you at the disadvantage in the first place. And so shows like this, sit back, attend them. People like Dr. Jim and John and Sierra, listen to their words. They're giving you the gold here, and you're going to have the keys to the kingdom once you absorb everything happening around you with folks like this. So just be curious and stay engaged.
I do have one quibble with what you said. I'm just here to referee things. I let other people say all the smart stuff. I'm just here for comic relief and semi deep thoughts. So, but I appreciate you saying that. I think one of the things that, at least for a takeaway for me, and this is a consistent theme that comes up when Lawrence and I are doing our various shows, is that regardless of what underrepresented community you come from, and this is especially important, well, I don't want to say it's especially important, but I think it's especially important for Black professionals. You're not going to get anywhere by keeping your head down, working hard, and hitting the benchmarks that are laid out in front of you. You have to be your own best megaphone and have agency for yourself, because it's very unlikely that there's going to be a mass of people that are going to do it for you. So I would say, if there's anything that I would advise, it's be your best PR agent that you can possibly be. Ask the hard questions. How do I get from here to where I want to go? What's the path? What would you recommend? Who do I need to go talk to? How do I accomplish this? We have to be intentional about that sort of stuff. Otherwise, we're going to be, kind of stuck in the mud and in quicksand. So that's my key takeaway, for whatever that's worth. So last but certainly not least, I want to make sure everybody has an opportunity to give their particulars on where they can find, where people that are watching and seeing this on demand will be able to find them. Sierra, I'll let you lead off. Where can people find you?
I am on LinkedIn all day, every day, Sierra Johnson Belser. And then you can also reach me via email at cbelser@excelsiorstaffing.com.
Awesome stuff. John, to you.
Yep. All over LinkedIn. Also my social drug of choice. So LinkedIn for sure. Otherwise, shaker.com, where you can see what we're doing in the world of employer brand and blending DEI and EB. And then also for the book, plantationtheory.com, where anybody who purchases from there gets a signed copy.
And just a show note for everybody that's watching, there will be an unboxing video of the signed copy of Plantation Theory that I haven't put out yet. So you will see that coming soon on TikTok, on YouTube, and on LinkedIn. So John, thank you. JD, Dr. Daverman, where can people find you?
On LinkedIn. And, if anyone cares about Facebook these days, there too.
That's only for people of yours and my generation, AKA old. So there's that. Not to offend anybody that happens to be in that demographic. So I want to thank everybody that is on the panel, and those of you who have just been having some great comments in the chat. I will respond, and our panelists will respond to those in the chat as well when we get offline. Wanted to thank you all for your insights. I want to thank each of you for advancing the conversation and really bringing some things forward that I think is going to be useful for the overall community and professional community, but especially the Black professional community. So I appreciate you hanging out. The intent of Talent Strategy 60 is to help talent professionals and professionals in general do more with less by leveraging community intelligence. And I think each of you have done a great job of that. Tune in next time for another great show. We appreciate your support, and reach out to each of us if you have any questions going forward. Thanks, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.